All right, this morning we continue on in our new series, Testament series. This is our fourth week. And our Testament series is basically hoping to accomplish in the space of 6 months, covering Genesis to Revelation, the entire Bible, the grand story. Basically trying to piece together the entire Bible as the whole narrative rather than just a series of isolated sort of either stories or letters or whatever. And many of us throughout our church experience, our Christian life, will hear this particular story and get something profound out of it and worthwhile, and then we'll read this little letter from Paul and think, yeah, that's really good, and I've got something out of that. And we'll get all of these little individual things throughout the 66 books of the Bible, and yet not really know that the intention of the Bible is that from Genesis 1 right to the end of Revelation, God has a continuous story, narrative plan that goes through the entire thing. And many of us will not know, although we might be familiar with a whole lot of stories, where on earth anything fits. So the intention of this series is hopefully to be very eye-opening to all of us as we step through that, so that we can pick up God's word at any time, open it up to any point, and know that this is not just some isolated story to make me think, oh, this is how I live for God a bit better, but to know how it fits in with God's entire cosmic purpose and how we fit into that. You can catch up with the first of the series on YouTube. So if you haven't been here and you're wondering, okay, hang on, I've missed out already, you're late to the party, doesn't matter. You'll be able to catch up. If you want to go a little bit more in depth, you can watch our YouTube channel, log on, and you can see those first 3 messages there. You can also pick up the book that this series is based on, which is by Michael Goheen. And it's called The True Story of the Whole World, Finding Your Place in the Biblical Drama. An outstanding book. I encourage you to read it, but don't read it and then not come on Sundays either. So otherwise, Michael Goheen will profit beautifully and this place will be empty. That could work. You'd probably actually get more out of his book than out of our messages, but it's good to be together, isn't it? Isn't it good to be together? Let's just say that. So a quick recap of where we've been so far. Act 1. So we've broken, and Michael Goheen kind of tries to put it in a narrative story. So Act 1, whoop, we've lost it. Hopefully we get this back. All right, Act 1. What we see is that God establishes his kingdom, creation. He births all of the universe out of nothing. And he says it is very good. And we know the picture that is portrayed in Genesis 1. Act 2, Bob looked at in the second week, which is what we know as the fall, where rebellion comes into that kingdom. Sin and evil comes into the world for the first time, and everything starts to unravel. Everything starts to decay and to distort. And so God's very good creation has now been corrupted. God has a choice of what to do. And so Act 3 comes in where God starts a process of restoration. He says, I'm not going to cancel the thing. I'm not going to abandon it. I'm not going to chuck it all away. What I'm going to do is I'm going to restore that beautiful creation back to the way I intended it to be. Even though it's now corrupt, even though it's dilapidated, even though humanity kind of continues to try and stuff it up, I am going to undertake a restoration program that will take it back to the perfection that I created it to be. And so this strategy, this restoration strategy that God chooses, is by taking one man, Abraham, and promising that he would be a blessing to all nations. Now, does anyone know the 2 things, can anyone yell out the 2 things that God promised, the key things that God promised to Abraham? Father of many nations, so people and place, land. Good. So people and land. 2 really critical things to remember when you think promise to Abraham or covenant with Abraham is people and land. Now that first part comes to fulfillment. Abraham has a son, Isaac. Despite being 100 years old, he has a son, Isaac. Isaac has a son, Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons who then become the 12 tribes of Israel. So Abraham, within just a few generations, becomes a people. So God has partly fulfilled his promise. But the question is, what on earth is God hoping to achieve through this group of people? Sure, he's called Abraham, he's turned them into a whole group of people, but what is he trying to achieve? Why has he called them and made them this promise? What's his purpose in all of this? Well, we discover exactly that in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we're covering 4 books of the Bible this morning. 38 chapters last week, 4 books this week. It's here that God reveals exactly why he has chosen his people and what he expects them to do. Last week, we finished off with the people of Israel increasing in number in the land of Egypt. So the 12 sons of Jacob, they start having families and it multiplies and multiplies. They all die off, Joseph dies off, and things then start increasing. But so while they've grown into a fairly large group, things aren't looking all that positive. We'll read at the start of Exodus chapter 1 from verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers, so the 12 tribes of Israel crew, and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, there in Egypt, by the way, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. And this is the irony of Pharaoh's tactics, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. You see, he said, we shall oppress them so they don't multiply. He oppressed them and they multiplied as a result of it. Not that smart a strategy. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them more ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So if Israel is going to become the nation God has promised they will, somehow they need to be liberated from the slavery and oppression they endure. They're a people, but they're not a nation. And God said, I will make you into a great nation. So somehow this people group needs to be liberated from Egypt and become their own nation. How on earth is that going to happen? Enter Moses. God, appearing as a burning bush, calls an Israelite by the name of Moses to go to Pharaoh and ask for the release of the Israelites. And we know the story. Pharaoh refuses. God, through Moses and Aaron, sends progressively 10 plagues. Plague 1, Pharaoh refuses. Plague 2, Pharaoh refuses. Plague 3, and so on. Comes to the final plague, which is where the firstborn male would die throughout Egypt, including the Israelites and every other nation, right? That the angel of death would come through and kill all firstborn males. Israel, however, would be spared this devastating event through the blood of a lamb on the door frames. This process was known as the Passover, where the Israelites would gather in their homes, put the blood of a lamb on the door frame as a symbol of the atonement, or a symbol of the blood sacrificed on their behalf, and it would protect them. And so when the death came through, it didn't settle on those houses. The whole of Israel's experience, down to their family life, law, politics, economics, recreation, every single part of their life was to reflect God's character and his original intent for life. And so God gives them 2 sets of guidelines as to how they were to do this. The first category was how to reflect God to the nations. A whole lot of rules and regulations are found in the book of Exodus about how they were to function in a whole range of areas of life. Right? You might read through Exodus and go, okay, rule after rule after rule after rule. All of these rules can basically be summed up in the 10 Commandments. You know the 10 Commandments, right? 10 laws that the people of Israel were to obey. Now, these instructions fit the way God has created the world and its people. So these commandments are actually the keys to living a healthy, flourishing human life. They are not constraints to make life difficult. Yeah? Some people look at commands and go, oh, God's being annoying. He's putting all these restrictions and boundaries around us because he wants to ruin our life. No, these are guidelines to say this is how life should be. This is how life is best lived. You will flourish the most if you live this way. And Israel's life under this law was to be so rich and flourishing that it would attract the nations of the earth to God, thereby being a blessing to all nations, as he promised they would be. That's the first category found in Exodus. The second category, well, the first category was how they were to reflect God to the nations. The second category was what to do when they failed that. Right? So the first one was, this is how you are to live to reflect me to the nations. The second category is, guess what? Living up to that is impossible. Right? That's perfection. And guess what? You're not perfect. So this is what you are to do when you fail that task. And Leviticus basically is a whole lot of instructions of how Israel were to go through a process of once again becoming cleansed or righteous before God in order that they could continue being his task. You see, if they failed, right, so they would inevitably fail to live up to the way God called them to live. So whenever they failed, if they didn't have something that once again made them holy, well, they wouldn't be distinct from all other nations, would they? Every other nation would look at them and go, well, you're no different. End of purpose of Israel. The reason Israel existed was to show God's glory and be a blessing to all nations. So God needed to say, okay, you failed at that task, so let me renew you. Let me cleanse you to take you back to this point. You'll fail again, then we renew and go back. And so Leviticus shows basically the major part of that is in Leviticus 16. It's called the Day of Atonement. On this day of the year, the high priest enters what's called the Holy of Holies, or the inner sanctuary of the tabernacle, which was the portable temple they'd set up in the desert. And the priest brings the sacrificial blood of animals, representing the sacrifice needed for the atonement of people's sins, and sprinkles it upon what was called the mercy seat. Through this act, Israel would be cleansed of their sins and could continue the task of being God's chosen people. They were brought back into relationship and righteousness with God. And the next two books of the Bible, Numbers and Deuteronomy, this is the quickest summary you'll ever hear of Numbers and Deuteronomy. The next two books basically follow Israel's journey of obedience to God's law and reflecting him to the nations, and the failure that they kept doing. And then God renews them, and then they fail, and then God renews them. This is the journey over Numbers and Deuteronomy of how that actually works out, how they get used to that whole experience of fulfilling the purpose that God has for them. Of course, this ancient atonement ritual, where blood would be spilled in order to atone for sins, would come to symbolize in a powerful way how God fully and finally atones for the sin of the whole world in Jesus Christ. But we'll come to that in a couple of months' time. We're not there yet. We're still in the Old Testament. So this morning, again, in summary, 4 books of the Bible. God's purpose for the people of Israel is to be a blessing to all nations by being a kingdom of priests, a holy nation that reflects the goodness and glory of God to the surrounding nations. They were to be a display piece, a light to the nations, a light in the darkness that would bear witness to the character of God and live such a flourishing life under his rule that it would reveal the intention of his original creation and attract all people to the Creator. 4 books summarized right there. It's very, very condensed because there is a lot of stuff in those books, right? We could take the next 50 years to go through those books. But that is a summary of that God sets apart Israel to be this display piece to the rest of nations, to reveal who he is, that they would be drawn to the Creator. And God himself sums up their task in Leviticus 19, verse 2. Be holy, be distinct, be separate, be righteous, be different to all the darkness of the nations, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. See, this command is not a command where God tells humanity that if we want to be saved, we have to be perfect like God. Rather, this is God calling the people of Israel to be an accurate reflection of him to the world, that they might know his goodness and glory. God is saying, I'm holy, and I need you to reflect me to the world. So be holy like I am. Otherwise, you have no role, because you're no different than the other nations. Be holy because I am holy, and you are to reflect me to the world. Before we finish with a song, I want to ask you if you would discuss a question on your tables for a few moments. In 1 Peter 2:9, and this is where it lands for us. In 1 Peter 2:9, the Apostle Peter, who hung out with Jesus for 3 years and then was the rock on which Jesus was going to build his church, the Apostle Peter says these words in 1 Peter 2:9. He says that the followers of Jesus, us who have chosen to follow Jesus, are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. So the exact phrases that God used of Israel way back in the time of the Exodus, Peter says, you as Christ's followers have the exact same calling. What he's saying is that we have entered into that ancient story. That story is not one that has gone past and we just sit as casual observers in the future. We have entered that very story. We are joined with Moses, with David, with all of those throughout the Old Testament. We have been joined to their purpose in this world, to be a channel of God's blessing to the nations, to reflect him to all people. We are to be a display piece where people say, when they look at us as individual Christians or as the church as a whole across the world, what they are to do is look at Christians and go, that's how human life should be lived. That's what God intended things to be like. That's how I get the most out of life. So 2 questions for you to discuss on your tables. Firstly, does this change your view, how you view the role of the church in today's world? What difference do you think it should make to the way we live and what we do? If we see that our purpose is to reflect God to the nations, is to be a blessing, is to show God to this world in everything we say, we do, and so on. That's why God gave instructions about things like marriage, about economics, about all of these little tiny details, because he's saying every little bit reflects me to the world. So how is it? How do you view the church differently, and how do you view your life differently if you were to say, I am actually a display piece on the shelf? That other people are looking at me and I'm to display what God is like to this world and God's intention. Secondly, in our culture today, what does it look like to be holy? Set apart in all areas of our lives to bear witness to God's creational design? How is it that we are not like the others? Right? And that's a very difficult question because we are in the world. We want to live amongst the world. It's not about setting up a little, community off to ourselves and we're literally geographically distinct. We are amongst this world. But how is it that they look at us and say, you are different, you are distinct, I notice the difference in you?